All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third episode of Data Talks, a series of free 45-minute webinars about using local data to inform housing policy. My name is Claudia Aiken. I'm Director of New Research Partnerships at the Housing Solutions Lab, and I'm joined by Martha Galvez, our Executive Director, who will be speaking with us today about surveys. And I'm also delighted to welcome our guest, Montana James. Montana is Deputy Director of Community Development for the City of Missoula in Montana, and she has graciously agreed to share Missoula's experience surveying their residents as part of their housing strategy, which is called A Place to Call Home. We can't wait to ask her all about it. I will start things off with a very brief introduction to the Housing Solutions Lab and this series. Martha will then lead us in a short presentation about surveys, when and why to do them, and some best practices. Then we'll have a conversation with Montana about Missoula's survey. And finally, we will have about 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A chat function at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. You will also be able to see a video of this and all of our webinars, along with some recommended reading on our website. I will drop the link to that page in the chat in just a minute. So if you're not familiar with the Housing Solutions Lab, we're based at the NYU Furman Center, and our mission is really to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the goal of advancing racial equity, health, and well-being. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you will tune into upcoming episodes as well, including a session in June on housing conditions data and one in August on storytelling with local data. Each of these sessions features a fireside chat with someone like Montana who has experience on the ground, and we'll be updating everyone here when registration for a new episode goes live. And now, without any more ado, I'm going to turn it over to Martha.
Okay, thanks so much, Claudia, and thanks, Montana, for being here and everyone for joining today. I am not going to talk for long. I'm going to take just a few minutes to lay some groundwork and give some context on resident surveys, why places do them, and some considerations for if you're thinking about launching a survey, and then really save most of our time to talk to Montana and hear about Missoula. So diving right in, why conduct a resident survey, right? Sometimes it is required as part of a HUD funding application or other federal funding application. Other times, as in the example we'll hear about from Missoula, it's used as a mechanism to really hear from the community and learn more about community preferences, community needs, community insight on different policy priorities or directions. And in some cases, it can be really narrowly focused to understand a specific issue, a specific property, or a specific program. But really, surveys are really appealing in that they can provide really powerful information to inform policy and to inform practice. They can reach a more diverse group than the people who might attend public meetings typically. They can provide information that's not available through national surveys, or it's more timely than might be available through other survey or local administrative data. And when done well, they provide an opportunity to build relationships and build a new communication channel with residents and with stakeholders, and to build some trust and some feedback between local government and residents. But that said, surveys are not without their challenges. They can be expensive, both in terms of actual costs like postage and printing or paying for incentives to respondents. And also in terms of staff time, they can be really labor intensive, or there might be costs associated with software to collect survey data, or with contracting with a firm or with consultants to help with the technical parts of design, administration, and data analysis. Surveys are also prone to bias if not done well. Some people may be more likely to see and have the opportunity to respond to a survey than others. Some may be more likely to complete the survey from beginning to end. It's important to try to design design a survey to reach the most representative sample possible. And that also individual survey items the survey itself can be tricky to design so that they actually get the information that you want. Ordering, length, wording, all really matters to have a powerful survey. So just as there might be different reasons that places do surveys or motivated to do surveys, cities might have different types of surveys that they are pursuing. So one example is resident needs assessments. So thinking about neighborhood satisfaction with neighborhood or housing, general well-being, housing conditions like physical quality or crowding or cost, unmet housing needs. For example, Kansas City regularly conducts resident surveys to understand housing and other needs and to assess the city's progress in meeting those needs. Surveys can also be used to get at resident attitudes and perspectives. So to gather input on priorities or views on different policy options that a city might have. We'll hear from Missoula and how their survey tried to get at those types of questions. And then finally, surveys commonly are used for program evaluation, so assessments of a particular initiative or intervention. One example is in the city of Oakland, where they surveyed residents who had applied for emergency rental assistance, both to understand need, why folks were applying, also folks' experience with the application process, and then for folks who did receive assistance, the impacts on their housing outcomes. So I'm just going to talk for a moment about survey methods. There's many of them, and I'll just note the most common ones. There are, and of the long list of possible methods, selection should really be driven by local goals and target audience and budget and timeline. Each of these, and I think we're all probably familiar with them, have their own pros and cons or trade-offs. So online, phone, text, mail, in-person, paper, some of these can also be used in combination. And I think we'll hear a little bit about Missoula's experience with that to try to reach a certain target population or to deal with non-response or low response. And just thinking about a couple of these options in more detail to give a sense of the trade-offs. For online surveys, they can be fairly straightforward to put together. There's lots of platforms to use to construct a survey that will also summarize results for you in a pretty straightforward way. SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, and Qualtrics, and many more I think folks are probably familiar with. They have the potential to reach a large group of people and have a pretty quick response time when they're completed. But the flip of that is there can be very low response rates. I think we are all guilty of not responding to some email online survey that has been presented to us, or there can be incomplete responses, people only getting so far and then leaving. But maybe most importantly, not everyone is comfortable with an online platform. There may be folks who have issues with the technology or have limited access to internet or don't use email as frequently. So there might be sampling bias as a result of relying exclusively on online surveys. And then thinking another option would, on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, is in-person surveys. These tend to have higher response rates, and there's a more personal engagement. There's a lot of opportunity there to gather nuanced information or to have folks ask questions, clarifying questions about the questions or the set of options. But the kind of trade-offs to that is that they can be extremely labor and time intensive to have individuals that have to be trained to carefully avoid bias in leading folks through questions inadvertently to respond in certain ways, or figuring out ways to make sure that they are safe. So in-person surveys might require a longer data collection period because of the intensity of what it takes to get responses, and just a bigger level of effort in general. So I won't go through the rest. We can provide some information on some general trade-offs for different types of survey data, but some considerations for folks who are thinking about how to design and administer a survey. And Claudia, you can move forward. So first and foremost, think about who your partners might be for this work. And I'm sure we'll hear about Missoula and Montana's experience there. You don't have to do this work alone, and you probably shouldn't. So think about who the partners are in the community to get the expertise that you need to both design and administer and analyze survey data. That could be local stakeholders to do outreach. That could be educational institutions to provide some help with statistical analysis or sampling. There are tons of examples of communities that are enlisting partners to either design or analyze or do data collection in their community. And then thinking about designing the survey itself, a good starting point is to make sure you have concrete research questions and goals as an entry point. Those research questions, those priorities should be your North Star for thinking about putting the survey together. All of the survey questions should reflect those goals. And to the extent possible, try to avoid survey mission creep, where it's an opportunity to ask lots of things that would be nice to know, but you don't really need to know to answer your primary research questions. A longer survey is not a better survey, and shorter surveys, particularly on the phone or online, might be the most effective to get at the sample size that you want to get to. Longer surveys tend to have lower response rates. The survey should be as accessible as possible, and by accessible, we basically mean keep it simple, use very simple language, avoid jargon, keep the questions direct, keep it short, and translate both in terms of complicated concepts. Might take some work to make accessible to folks who are not experts in housing policy, but also translate into the languages that make sense in your community. Whatever you come up with should be tested. Test with individuals from the target populations you think you might really want to focus on or might be concerned about. Test the language translations. Sometimes words are used differently in different communities and might not resonate in an interpretation into a different language might not make sense in practice with the folks that you are actually trying to reach. And then thinking about administering the survey, again, start with a plan, a clear sampling and recruitment strategy. Who do you want to reach? What subgroups, neighborhoods do you need to think about oversampling? How are you going to reach a representative sample? Or if that's not possible, what is your goal for sample size and for reaching different populations in order to get reliable results from your survey? And then, be prepared to work hard to get at those response rates or get at those target sample numbers. That might mean multiple reminders, using different modes, figuring out who your partners are to do outreach, considering incentives if response rates are really low, whether a direct payment to folks for filling out something, particularly if it's long or intrusive, asking really personal questions. Or giving folks an opportunity to complete the survey and be in a lottery to get some modest incentive at the end. And then finally, you might anticipate needing extra time to address either low response rate or slow response rates so that you can have extra time to collect the information that you need. And then finally, thinking about analyzing survey results. Again, start with a plan. What is your plan that should go back to your core research questions. Know what your top line survey questions are that really speak to each of your research priorities, what you really want to learn from the survey from the start, and what are the subgroups that you want to be able to look at results for and to do crosstabs and compare responses by different groups for different survey items. And part of that is understanding whether you have reached the sample size or have a representative sample, or understanding the statistical power that your sample gives you. Again, you might need outside help to do some statistical analysis, or understand the validity of some of the responses that you're getting, the certainty that your survey sample provides. And then finally, be prepared for how you're going to share results with residents and stakeholders. That means just sharing out, these were the responses to the questions, and this is how comfortable we are with how reliable those responses are, and also what the next steps are for how you're going to use that information and how that's going to feed in to local decisions. And with that, I will hand it back to Claudia. She has some examples of places that have taken on different types of surveys.
Great, thanks, Martha. And just a reminder to folks who may have joined a little late, we are really looking forward to your questions, so be sure to use the Q&A function to submit those. I see a couple in there already, so thank you, and please feel free to keep dropping those in. So yeah, just before we turn to Montana and asking her all our questions about Missoula, I want to introduce a few examples of other places to give you a sense of the real variety of approaches that cities can take here. I won't be spending too much time on this, but we will be posting these slides so that you can click through these at your leisure and visit the links that are in the upper right-hand corner. So the first one I want to highlight here is Boulder, Colorado, and this is just a great example of a city conducting a survey to understand a very specific problem. In this case, what are the housing-related reasons that people are commuting into Boulder but not choosing to live there, and what housing policies could help change that kind of decision-making? And the city partnered with both major employers and the university to reach their target group and got a pretty impressive number of responses. And you can see kind of on the right-hand side here that this allowed them to gain an understanding of who in-commuters are, and even then compare the housing affordability between residents and in-commuters, which is really powerful information. This next example from Bellevue in Washington State is an example of using a survey to motivate political change. So in this case, a coalition of advocacy groups actually came together and partnered with a professional pollster to survey residents about housing affordability broadly in 2022. And the questions were framed in a way designed to motivate policymakers. So here you can see, for example, that 68% of residents feel that Bellevue's housing stock was not meeting the community's needs. So pretty powerful number. And lastly, from Kalamazoo County in Michigan is an example of using a survey to inform a housing strategy. It's also kind of a neat example of combining a lot of different outreach methods. So mailers, they used an online survey, and they also did in-person engagement to reach a specific group, which was unhoused residents. And the county worked with a local research nonprofit based in Kalamazoo to send an online survey link to 35,000 some randomly selected addresses, and also promoted the survey on social media. And then homeless service providers sat down with their clients and went through the survey with them on phones and tablets. Both surveys ultimately informed the county's housing needs assessment and their strategy process. All right, so with that, I will stop sharing and we'll have more of a conversation here.
Thanks,
I'm gonna pass
Claudia.
it back to you. Yeah, go
Thank
ahead.
you. Yeah, I'll kick it off. And I want to acknowledge, I'm sorry, Montana, but you are Montana from Montana.
Yes.
I screw that up and say in Missoula and Montana, but so got that out of the way. Thank you for being here. And I guess a good place to start is to just, can you tell us a little bit more about the process for a place to call home, which is your Missoula's housing plan from 2019 that your survey work fed into. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that plan and how your survey work fit into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And yes, the name can get very confusing. I'm from here and I live here and just all Montana. Yeah, so Missoula is a relatively small community. I mean, we're large in the context of Montana cities, but relatively small. We have about 70,000 or 75,000 residents. And I would say, we have historically had a really high cost of living relative to local wages. Growing up here, I kind of always remember that being a part of the community conversation, that our housing costs are high. Folks tend to have not enough funds to maintain their housing. But really in 2015, 2016, 2017, we started to see that disparity increase more significantly. And so the city developed a new Office of Housing and Community Development at that time. And that office was really charged with administering our HUD entitlement funds and then developing a housing strategy for the city. So this was very much a community driven kind of scrappy effort. I think the total housing policy or strategy budget was $35,000 over the course of a couple of years. And so, we relied a lot on partnerships and, donated in kind time from residents and experts. And it really started with a gaps and needs analysis that was translated to a mayor appointed steering committee of folks in the community that had expertise or particular experience in the housing market. And then that group sort of broke out recommendations and provided them to smaller technical working groups who sort of dug in, did more exploration in the strategies, tested them, and kind of refined them for final recommendation.
Okay. And for the survey work, what was it that you were trying to learn? Were there particular folks you were trying to reach or particular questions that you were most interested in?
Yeah. So, throughout the policy development process, which did take about a year and a half, the staff in housing and community development, we were really focused on being out in the community and sharing updates through neighborhood councils, city council meetings, different neighborhood events and conversations. But we really realized as those technical working groups started to narrow in on certain strategies that we just were not hearing from a big segment of our population. We started to sort of see the same folks at all of the different events that we were hosting and hear from the same folks via email or phone calls. So, we were primarily concerned about hearing from low, moderate income residents, just folks that are typically not able to or not showing up at those different meeting opportunities. So we wanted to kind of target getting feedback from those residents, knowing that that they were experiencing the housing crunch differently than other residents or other neighborhoods were experiencing it. We knew from the gaps and needs analysis that our low moderate income neighborhoods were absorbing the most growth and the most density in the community. And we knew just that those residents were facing higher rates of displacement and housing cost burden. So that was really the target population that we wanted to reach.
And so how did you go about it? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you, yeah, get to the folks that you don't already know?
Yeah, it took some iteration and some conversation with other city staff and other partner organizations, but we kind of went through the different survey methods or outreach methods that you talked about a few minutes ago, and really landed on wanting to invest the time and effort to go to folks where they are in their neighborhoods, at home, at times where we felt like we could take a little bit of their evening or their Saturday or Sunday. And so to do that, we knew that we would need a fair amount of just human power to go out and get into the neighborhoods. So we reached out to the University of Montana, to several of their master's programs that we thought had some connection to building that expertise in surveying and data analysis. And we ended up with a really interesting group of graduate level students who opted in and were interested in participating in this project. We were able to work with the departments to make sure that they could get academic credit in some capacity through their programs to do this work. And it was really a semester-long process for them. So we had folks from Masters in Public Health, Masters of Social Work students, Masters of Public Administration, and I think some sociology folks as well. So it was a really interesting group of students sort of studying and practicing surveying and different methodologies. So it was cool to see them all come together. And we definitely grappled with a lot of the things you talked about of kind of how to remove jargon from the survey language, how to make sure it was short enough and concise enough, approachable enough to reach our research goals. So that student group and I worked together for a couple months to kind of identify the goals of the research, which for us at that time was really kind of testing out the strategies that those work groups were recommending and see which ones resonated with folks, which ones didn't make as much sense, didn't have as much promise, and then to just understand more broadly how they were experiencing the impacts of the housing market. So we worked together kind of to define those goals, develop the tool, the survey tool, and then to create a plan to get out into the neighborhood. And it was 3 neighborhoods in the community to really target those.
And how, just thinking about the challenge of making these complex concepts understandable to folks who are not tracking it, right?
Yeah.
How did you do that? Was it sounds like it was you and the students who were iteratively, did you test any of the questions or language?
We did. And I will say I very much needed the students because it was hard for me to get out of that jargon. So yeah, we kind of sat together in a room at the university library for many evenings, sort of drafting questions, testing them. They took the questions back to their faculty advisors and peers and sort of tested them with those folks. We got a lot of great feedback that way on shifting language, shifting question structure. And then we also tested on some other city staff guinea pigs as well to just see if the questions made sense, if it flowed appropriately. So it was, I think, many weeks of going through that kind of writing, rewriting, testing, but having those, I think especially those faculty advisors at the university was really powerful because they provided some robust feedback on ways to do it better.
That's great. And did you find once you started using the survey that you had to refine more? Or once it was out, it was out?
I think once it was out, it was out. We were kind of committed to the timeline at that point and navigating how many weekends they could be out in the neighborhoods before they went on spring break and had to meet their kind of finishing up the report and all of those pieces before their finals. So once it was out, it was out. But I think based on their feedback, they kind of got what they needed. I think it worked really well. And I think your point to having the human in front of you to clarify or talk through some of the questions that folks had, I think was really helpful.
And just to that point, I saw that you did use different approaches, or you had actual paper for some
Yeah.
folks, and then most of it was, it sounds like, on a tablet with an individual person.
Yeah.
How did you end up doing that?
Yeah.
How'd that work out?
Yeah, so the student group was able to work with a local political advocacy, kind of get out the vote organization to pull maps of the neighborhoods and then do a canvas training to sort of understand how to stay safe when you're canvassing, what are the best practices, do what feels comfortable, kind of all of those training elements. And so then the students actually took their, I think, laptops or tablets out, and they knocked on doors at every third house in each of these targeted neighborhoods. They kind of stood on the doorstep or sometimes went in and talked to folks and collected the feedback and entered it themselves as they were having the conversation.
Mhm.
But they also had a leave behind flyer at every house where there wasn't an answer, and it had a link to the survey so folks could go on later and complete the survey themselves online if they weren't home when we knocked on their doors. So I think that enabled us to sort of connect with folks even if they weren't home, but I think the majority of our responses were still those in-person kind of student entered surveys.
But, and so, thinking about what you got, the information that you pulled together, what were some of the most impactful responses that you found?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I'm looking at my notes to remember how many we got. Uh, I kind of thinking about the impact. I think the students were surprised at how much people wanted to talk to them and how long they wanted to spend with them to tell them about their own experiences and their thoughts and ideas around the housing market. They ended up with just over 200 responses. And again, I think the vast majority were from those in-person conversations. Um, but I think overall the first several questions in the survey were just those kind of testing out the housing policy strategies, and the most of the responses were supportive of the strategies that we had proposed. So I think that was affirming and helpful, and it also gave us a sense of there were varying degrees of support. So most had a 50% plus support rate, but some were like, yes, 95% people agreed with this strategy. So that I think was helpful for us to just wrap our heads around and understand which strategies were um, felt the most promising for residents. And then I think some of the more interesting or surprising information really came from the open-ended questions at the end, just asking folks about their housing experience, how were they feeling those impacts, and then we had one question about the definition of affordable housing, which we have always kind of struggled with how to articulate it here locally because we have so many different, there's the HUD definitions and levels and what is area median income, and it can get really jargony and in the weeds very quickly. And so I think that one was a very interesting one to sort of test out just the basic, are you spending 30% of your income or more on your housing costs and utility costs? And we got some very interesting feedback on that, highlighting some other compounding challenges that we hadn't necessarily been thinking about in the housing policy. Childcare costs was a huge one. And so that sort of and since then we've kind of maintained this interest in how do we build up childcare infrastructure and delivery for the community, and thinking about how to talk about that in addition to the traditional housing costs. Transportation costs often came up, and then just more conversation about particular utilities, and that raised some things about the quality of housing that we have here and how high energy costs are. So I think all of those pieces, it just sort of surfaced additional considerations and additional context that we had not been thinking about sort of in our narrow housing policy lens.
I have lots of questions about that.
I know.
Maybe,
I should interrupt though, because
okay,
we're getting
we're
lots
getting
of
questions.
questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure we can get to a few of them. Um,
Go ahead.
So the first one here is, if you receive a low turnout in responses for your survey, what do you do? How do you move forward? Do you just start over? Do you try to use that small sample in any way? What do you guys think?
You want to start?
Why don't you go from your experience?
Yeah. Yeah, so this was a low number, 200 residents, right, out of 75,000 plus. But I think because our focus on the survey was a particular subpopulation, and because we got such rich qualitative data and stories and feedback, we still, we proceeded. We knew that we wouldn't get a huge response rate, and we still I think the data that we got and the information we got was still really impactful. And it was of particular interest to our city council, who were very aware of the lack of feedback that we had gotten to date from particular neighborhoods. And so I think, especially when it's qualitative data, there's a general recognition that you can't get hundreds, unless you have a massive budget and lots of times, you can't get thousands of different kind of data points that are qualitative and that are sort of digestible and impactful. So we proceeded, and I think it was very useful.
Great. Yeah. Kayla has a question here, again for you, Montana, about how much of the original budget was allocated towards conducting the survey work specifically.
That's a good question. Nothing from the original budget was allocated for the survey work. And so that's why we really pursued this partnership with the university. And we did some thinking about kind of what are the other benefits that we can provide to students in return for this work. And so the course credit was a big chunk of it. I wrote many letters of recommendation for those students as they were wrapping up their master's program. And we did provide small stipends that we just pulled from our other general fund budget that we had remaining for the year. So it's definitely there. I think there are pros and cons. I really enjoyed working with the students. It took a lot more of my time as staff, I think, than if we had contracted with a firm. And then, the end report is not a beautiful, polished project or product, but it was like the content was really powerful and really strong. So we had virtually no budget. I think it was like a couple $1,000s in stipends, but staff time and working with students was a good fit for our need.
That's amazing. Yeah. Okay.
And I know there's so many questions,
I
and I think
know.
we'll try to answer as many as we can in follow up as well. Or but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact of the survey information on decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned, we knew that our elected officials were really interested in the survey results. So we got the initial report from the students, and we brought that report back to each of those technical working groups as they were wrapping up their meeting cycle and developing their final recommendations. So those groups used the survey inputs. And I think they did some kind of small tweaking. Like I mentioned, most of the results really affirmed the strategies as we had them proposed. But they did do some tweaking based on the survey report. And then we had the students come and present to our city council on the process, the kind of the experience, and then the results and their interpretations of the results. And I think that was again, a helpful experience for the students, because they got that kind of practice in presenting to elected officials, and a really impactful presentation for our city council members. I think they referenced some of the findings for months and months and after that presentation. And then we used the survey results to design our implementation plan for the policy. So the strategies that had really high support rates, we prioritized in the implementation plan wherever we could, depending on budget and all of those pieces. And then we also use the results for things like how we describe and talk about what affordability means and how these programs target different populations. So we use the survey results kind of in a lot of different components of that final policy development and then the implementation strategy.
That's really interesting. Claudia, I don't I have questions, but I defer to your question.
Well, I'll ask one more from the audience then. We've got one from Mike in Charlottesville. He says, residents in two historically Black neighborhoods are about to embark on a small area planning process with the city. Can you give any advice about how to find a consultant that has experience and is proficient in community outreach? How can we make sure we're asking the right questions and getting good applicants? Any advice for them, Martha?
I think we can follow up with some information and some guidance. Montana, I don't know if you have went down that road. Did you look for consultants or firms to provide that assistance?
We did not look for consultants just based on the lack of budget that we had available. But we did reach out to neighborhood specific groups, kind of organizing groups, advocacy groups, the neighborhood associations, and started there in terms of how to reach folks and get the word out. So I think that can always be helpful, but I don't know about consultants, especially I feel like they vary so much on like the east side of the country, west side of the country. That's a different pool.
I think that's right. And, a starting point is to understand what it is that you need the consultant to really do. And whether it's sort of the full package or it's more of kind of an advisory role and you have some capacity internally to do some of the work, like really picking apart what the pieces are that a consultant support is most needed for. But we can try to follow up with some information there.
Definitely. Yeah, another great question here from Chris in Pennsylvania. How can we address and remain conscious of the possibility that certain communities, particularly around housing, might be experiencing research fatigue?
Mm.
I have
Yeah.
research fatigue sometimes. Montana, I don't know if you want to go first with that.
I I would say that in Missoula, we're very aware of it and we've been talking about it, but I don't know that we have kind of cracked the code for that. We've been trying to, at the time that we did this survey, I don't think we were there yet on research fatigue. It was really the beginning or kind of first time since the 90s that we had started this housing conversation and direct outreach. But now, since then, we've been trying to just be really thoughtful about what kind of information we need, how we're going to use it, like really where is it going to go, how is it going to be implemented, and then if we feel like it's absolutely necessary to try to combine efforts with other, we've got the county here that's also doing research and developing a strategy, and then also absolutely trying to think about how do we compensate folks that we're extracting information from, and how do we make the process accessible and beneficial for them as well, rather than just going in, collecting information and taking it out.
And never hearing back,
Mm-hmm.
leaving folks never having heard back about what happened to that information. I think part of the fatigue is also a mistrust in some communities of what is going to happen next, and investing time and energy that then they don't really know what the use of their time was or the impact.
Yeah.
So to the extent possible, yeah, being very focused on what you really need to know from people, providing incentives when possible, and having very clear talking points and around why you're collecting this information and what the use of it will be and what will happen next. and working with folks who are trusted partners in communities to build that trust that it's worth it for folks to engage in a research effort is one way to deal with the fatigue, and motivate folks to believe that their investment is an investment in a future outcome.
And I
think,
will
yep.
add, oh, sorry. I know we're at the end here, but I
Go
think
ahead.
that's especially why, we focused on doing these in-person conversations, because we knew that folks were struggling, and we felt like just a online survey or a paper survey or another public meeting wouldn't really provide the space for that relationship building and for just the deeper conversation. And I think we really saw that in the amount of time that residents wanted to spend with the students to answer these questions. And we did intentionally follow up. We asked folks if they wanted us to follow up with them and let them know the results, if they wanted to share their contact information afterwards. And then we did do a lot of follow up with the folks that did share their information, making sure they knew about when meetings were coming up, what the final policy looked like, kind of what does the implementation plan look like. And I think it really helped us to just build some relationship with those neighborhoods and residents.
Great. Thank you so much, Montana. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for your terrific questions and the many more that we did not get to. We will be following up with you on. We will be posting a video of this on our website. You will get an email blast if you were here today with a link to that video, to the slides, to some reading to go along with it. So I know a lot of you have asked for that, and just keep your eyes out for it. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Montana.